In the Mi'kmaq language, asismatal means overlooking someone. This seems to be an appropriate word to describe the relationship between the Canadian federal government and Canada's First Nations people. In 1876, the Indian Act was created to preserve Indian rights and the small share of land that was to remain with the native people. But the Act has been criticized for its singling out a portion of Canada's population based on race, as well as its unfair treatment of Indians who live on reserves and those who do not. This was an act that was made for the native and not by the native. It was an act made by Parliament, which is supreme. Therefore, the act can be changed without consulting natives. Since its inception, the Indian Act has evolved. Over the last 60 years, there have been many changes in the government's stance on Native issues. The Indian Act and reserve system has not been good for Canada's First Nation people. In fact, the poverty of Canada's First Nations has led to international disgrace because leaders such as the Pope and Nelson Mandela have noted it. Many Canadians would argue that our Indigenous people have been coddled and given special perks due to their ethnicity. By looking at the changes in the standard of living, education, and employment since 1945, it is clear that the Canadian government has not indulged First Nations people and that federal policy has not moved beyond rhetoric. The impoverishment of our First Nation is entrenched in the Indian Act itself. The exclusive aspect of reserves that only status Indians, with some exceptions, can live on them, reduces the public's familiarity with them. Therefore, it is easy to be blind to the living conditions that our First Nations people must endure daily. Property ownership is rare on Canadian reserves. To ensure Native communal living, the Indian Act has given the title to most reserve lands to the entire Native community. Band councils have the legal authority to evict families from their homes with 24-hour notice. There is very little incentive for individuals to build or improve assets if there is no security of possession. Our access to potable water is taken for granted in most communities in Canada. However, 25% of the water systems on reserves pose potential health and safety risks to the people using them. This is because there are no laws and regulations governing drinking water in First Nation communities. In the early 1960s, housing subsidies became available to assist First Nations people in obtaining adequate, affordable housing. Although the government spends a considerable amount on Aboriginal housing, $247 million annually, the acute demand for housing remains. Four or five families share a 3-bedroom house, which in return increases the deterioration of the house. More than half of the 76,000 houses on reserves are in need of renovation or replacement, so the housing shortfall will widen due to the deterioration and to an anticipated 50% increase in the households over the next 10 years.